You see, there are some people who are laced with sympathy, and they mean well, but the truth is there comes a time in any situation where sympathy is not enough. There are other people who are filled with antipathy, which is they oppose everything, they're against things, and there's a place for opposition. There is a place sometimes to simply say, I'm not for it. But sympathy is not best. Antipathy has moments, but the worst of all is apathy. When you don't care about anything. It's one thing to be sympathetic, and it's one thing to be in opposition, but there's a problem when you don't care about anything or anybody. It's one of the things that I sort of struggle with every now and then, and I realize that it's because generationally I may be deficient, and some of you are better at reaching generations than perhaps I am. But when I'm talking to a young person who is struggling, perhaps say in school, and I'm trying to get them to recognize the value of why they need an education. And what I get from them is the response, whatever. Something in my blood. Because I'm not mad that intellectually or scholastically you might be deficient. If you're deficient, somebody can help you with that. There are tutors, there are mentors. People can help you to learn and get what it is you don't know or don't possess. But I don't know how to make you care. And when you are arrogant in your ignorance, that upsets me, because I think too much has been sacrificed for you to act like you don't care if you learn or not. And of all the things that bother me, sympathy doesn't bother me. Antipathy doesn't bother me. But it's something about abject apathy when you just don't care. When you don't care about how anybody else is doing but yourself. This is the problem I have with the prosperity gospel that's sweeping the church. When all you're concerned about is that you're blessed and not concerned that anybody else is, that's a problem for me. Because I don't understand a gospel that says I'm just supposed to be blessed, when in fact Abraham was blessed so that he could be a blessing to the rest of the world. And here in the text we have somebody who is challenged to care and decides to care beyond their own particular situation. And I'm submitting to you that we are moving in a direction where literally the lives of people, militaristically, economically, and socially, are going to be impacted always by those who represent them. There is a way in which everything you do is tethered to those who claim to speak for you, whether it is around the militaristic movements in our country, whether it is the economic movements in our country. However we are set and sealed sociologically, they are impacted by the people who say they are representatives of us. Do you know that's right? In fact, inside this text, remember that the whole movement to insert Saul as a leader, as a king, was because Israel was tired of going in and out of battles, being represented by the judges, Samuel and Eli and all those kinds of folks. And so they went to Samuel one day and they said, look here, we want a king. And you can argue about the merits of their asking when God says to Samuel, don't sweat it, it's not you, they're upset with me. But what they do is they elect somebody, they raise them up as king, called Saul, who is anointed and ordained then by Samuel in order to be their representative when they go into battle. But you just read the story along with me. And the truth is, while Saul was identified to fight for them, the truth is that Saul will not fight for them. Saul is a guy who likes the position and he likes the pomp, but he ain't built like that. The text says that Saul was head and shoulders above everybody else, which means he was bigger than the average Israelite. So that at least in comparison to Goliath, if anybody had a chance of winning the battle, it would have been Saul. Because in the ancient world, kings were supposed to fight each other to spare the lives of everybody else. But when Goliath comes as a champion and begins woofing, Saul is not even willing to stand in the gap and fight for the people he claims he loves. And I'm telling you, whenever you got a leader that's not willing to fight for the common good of the people he or she is supposed to represent, that ain't no leader. When you care, you are challenged, and sometimes it will get you hurt. You can't judge based upon what people look like. Even the man of God gets it wrong in the text. When Samuel went to ordain the leader who was coming, he made the mistake. It's in chapter 16. He looked at some of the brothers of Jesse and thought surely God was saying it was him. But God said, no, that's not the one. Because you can't judge on the basis of what somebody looks like. David didn't look much like a leader, but guess what? He was God's man for that day. You can't judge on the basis of what somebody looks like, because there are rooms and places and nooks and crannies in the heart that can't nobody see but the Lord. This man named Saul, in the midst of this sort of portrait of biblical warfare in ancient Israel, reminds us that there is something about this idea in which people sometimes are called to care, and caring is always a challenge. It challenges your fears and it challenges your shame. You say, Dan, how do you know that? It's here inside the text. You see, if you look at chapter 17, verses 1 down through around about 11, the focus is on the weaponry. The author spends more time describing the weapons than he does the actual battle. Because there are some people who are so concerned for militaristic advantage and weaponry that they don't care what's going on with the common good. That's what goes on in your nation's militaristic budget. That's why they will cut your SNAP, but they will enforce and enhance the military budget. Because they care much more about fighting than they do feeding. You better stay awake. That's why a budget is always a moral document. People say that a budget is not a moral document. A budget is a moral document because a budget tells us what you care about. And when everything in your budget cuts people's stuff, it tells us that you don't care about people. Your budget tells where your passions are, where your priorities are. It tells how you spend your money. If I look in your checkbook this morning, I can tell what you're passionate about. If I trace out your debit card, I can tell what you care about. There is a focus here. And what happens is every now and then there are people in the midst of this challenge to care because it presses them. Every now and then you need somebody who will fight for you because you can't fight for yourself. You say, is that in the text? Look here inside verse 11. When Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. Because sometimes when you're in a situation where you can't refuse to fight, and at the same time, you can't fight because you're humiliated. Now you suffer the indignity that is both humiliation and shame. You see, the men in this text are afraid to fight. And guess what? They're afraid to fight, and so is Saul. Because sometimes people become like their leader. See, when you look at a leader, you're supposed to look at the leader and see things in the leader that God wants to see in the people. So you can see characteristics and priorities in the leader and know that that's what God is calling for in the people. That's why he sent them as the leader. And you're looking at Saul, who doesn't want to fight. And you're looking at a military that has now got shame added to humiliation. For 40 days, Goliath went back and forth for 40 days. Listen, if somebody did that for 40 days, even the punk in you, at some point, even the punk in you says, we got to fight. Even if I lose and get whooped, I still, 40 days. You remember growing up in the hood, you could get a reputation not if you won, but if you were just willing. You could get knocked out, but people would say, but you know what? He was in there slinging, he was doing, he was fighting. Because you could get a reputation not if you won, if you was just willing. You didn't have to win, but you had to fight. Do I have a witness? You got no respect in the hood for laying down. You had at least to get up and duke it out. For 40 days, there's nothing, and Saul is content with that. And now here comes David, somebody who doesn't have the right appearance, who doesn't look like a leader, and yet God has anointed him and says, you know what, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use you now in a different way, because sometimes it is trivial faithfulness that leads to extended responsibility. You see, look at the text. Here's what it says. He in verse 17, one day Jesse said to David, he says, look, take this basket of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread and carry them quickly to your brothers, and give these 10 cuts of cheese to their captain. See how your brothers are getting along, and bring back a report on how they're doing. David's brothers were with Saul and the Israelite army at the valley of Elah fighting against the Philistines. So David left the sheep with another shepherd and set out early the next morning with the gifts as Jesse had directed him. Notice David has already been engaged in what is typically a trivial errand. He was just told to take some victuals, supplies to the men in the battlefront. You know, and listen, don't just give stuff to your brothers. Remember, there are captains and others. Why, Jesse? Because I'm concerned for the common good. Not just my boys, not just my peeps, not just my interests. I'm concerned for everybody. Now, on a very typical and sort of, I guess, plain errand of just taking food to the men, David is now suddenly snatched by God to be used in a different kind of way. That's why you can think of no task as nominal. You see, you never know when your simple assignment will lead to something greater. That's why you do everything you do to the glory of God, because you never know if the simple thing you were given to do, God eventually wants to use in a larger way. That's why you don't complain about this and that. You just do what is given your hand to do, and you do it to the glory of God, to the best of your ability. And sometimes God will take a trivial thing and elevate it to a different kind of responsibility. That's why no matter what you do it to the glory of God. You don't have to preach like Paul. If you've been given an assignment, just do it to the best of your ability. Because when God is calling people to care, he takes some of the performance of their past and uses it to move them into greater responsibility. He was a shepherd. He was tending sheep. But notice something. Whenever you are challenged to care, this is what you can expect. Inside verse 28, but when David's oldest brother Eliab heard David talking to the men, he was angry. What are you doing around here anyway? He demanded. What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? I know about your pride and deceit. You just want to see the battle. Let me tell you something. There's always somebody. You know, be prepared that whenever you are challenged to care, there's always somebody that's going to come at you and try to minimize you and devalue your efforts and make you think that what you are and what you're doing has no point. You see, there's always the person that don't want to do nothing. He been there 40 days, woofing back and forth. He been there all this time. He ain't picked up nothing to fight nobody. And now when David comes along, suddenly he got a conscience. That's always the way it works. And here, you know, in our vernacular, culturally, we know that whenever people use the word little, they're trying to demean you. He literally says, wait, why aren't you taking care of them few sheep? It's sort of like, let me see if I make this. If you mad with somebody and they got a car, and they say they can't pick you up. Then you say to them, "We're gonna take your little car." Because whenever you hear the word "little," you know you're about to be defamed, right? You know. Well, go and take your little song. Go and take your little hat. Go and take your little car. Go and take your little. Whenever we use the word "little," we fixing to tell you that you ain't nothing, right? Here's what he said: go back. How come you ain't back there with your little sheep? And there's always somebody who comes at you, and here's what you got to do. You got to expect to be rejected. These are his brothers, and admittedly it's hard when somebody close to you rejects you, but here's the deal, that there are some people who can never see what everybody else sees very clearly. David sees very clearly what they don't see. David sees that this ain't just something for the military. There is not something militaristically happening here. There is something theologically going on here. Whenever you have to deal with people because you care, you're going to experience rejection before you succeed. You're also going to come with people who not only oppose you, but people who are going to try to tell you how to do it. I'm never going to be able to get through all this, so I'm going to close in about 2 minutes. Stay with me. Listen. When Saul comes to David, it says, "This is the gear that I want you to wear." It's because it has worked for Saul. But just because it works for Saul doesn't mean it's going to work for David. And when you are called to care, you've got to know what works for you as opposed to trying to do what other people tell you you should do. But let me also give you another caveat that comes out of antiquity that I think might be closer to the point. When Saul says to David, "I want you to wear my gear," it's because of all of the things that were common in battle array. The one thing that was different was what the king wore. You see, the king's regalia stood out. And whenever you put on the king's stuff, people knew that's the king. So if I can get David to wear my stuff, people who don't know will think that it's me going out to fight, when in truth I'm afraid to fight. And I don't mind misrepresenting the truth if it'll make me look better. So at the end of the day, the people up close would know that it was David, but thousands were at this battle. And the thousands who didn't know would see my plume, see my colors, see my shield, and if he wins, they'll know that I won the battle. It's misrepresentation. And there are always people who think you don't have enough sense to know who they really are, and will try to deceive you with smoke and mirrors and stuff unless you are discerning and say, "No, I ain't falling for it." Whenever you are challenged to care, you got to recognize that that is what's going on. David said, no, you don't understand something. I know something about this. I know what I've been called to do here. You keep your stuff. Because at the end of the day, when this battle is done, God is going to be victorious because I'm going to be what he called. You can't love God and not be concerned about the common good. Not just a small percentage, but what's good for everybody. What's best for us all. And when you are challenged to care, you need to be thinking about men and women who represent you, who are not afraid, who will fight, not for their own self-interest, but for the interests of other people. Not for their own agenda, but for the common good. And the challenge to care is because, listen, that's who the Lord calls us to be. That's the responsibility we have, not only as Christians, but as citizens, to be more concerned about the common good and to, in many cases, fight for it. Why do I say this? Because I know somebody who ended up destroying the enemy with his own weapon. I'm done, so give me 2 more minutes. At the end of this story, David takes the sword of the enemy, the weapon of the enemy, and destroys the enemy with his own weapon. The stone arguably doesn't kill him, but it renders him unconscious and allows David to get to him and take his own weapon and destroy him with his own weapon. Huh? One day, you and I had an enemy. The enemy was called death. In fact, when Satan caused us to fall, suddenly eternal life was eclipsed. We had been designed to live forever, but now we had this new enemy called death. And because of the fear of death, spent years and millennials trembling because of it. Then one day Jesus decided, I'm going to take the same weapon called death. I'm going to take the same weapon called death. And because of my own death, I'm going to gain victory over death and transform death from a weapon of woe to a reward for the righteous. And now the same thing that I used to be afraid of, death and dying, because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Because he lives, all fear is gone. Because he conquered the enemy called death that was against me. He took death's thing and used it against himself to gain my victory. Somebody ought to bless the Lord up in here. Somebody ought to say, Lord, thank you for caring for me, raising me up, setting me on a street called straight. Thank you.